Would a no first use pledge make the world safer? I'm Donna Davis, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello, and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Donna Davis. Rumors abound that the Obama administration is considering adopting the so-called No First Use Pledge, a promise that the United States would not be the first party in an international conflict to use nuclear weapons. Supporters of the pledge say that it would reassure foreign regimes and help de-escalate international crises. But critics argue that the pledge would take an arrow out of America's foreign policy quiver. Joining us to discuss the issue is Elbridge Colby, the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow at the Center for a New America Security. He served as policy advisor to the Secretary of Defense's representative for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, an expert advisor to the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, and a staff member on the President's Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding WMD. He also served with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq and with the State Department. He co-edited Strategic Stability, Contending Interpretations, and Nuclear Weapons and United States-China Relations, A Way Forward. And also joining us is Tom Colina, Director of Policy at the Plowshares Fund. He previously served as Research Director of the Arms Control Association. He was the Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security and the Director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He has published widely in major magazines and journals and has appeared frequently in the national media, including the New York Times, CNN, and NPR. He has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and regularly briefs congressional staff. Tom has a degree in international relations from Cornell University. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Tom Colina, could you explain how the No First Use Pledge would make the world safer?
Sure, Donna. It's actually a simple idea, which is the main thing when you're dealing with nuclear policies to make sure a nuclear war never starts, because it will be the end of civilization as we know it. So we need to take this very seriously, and we need to take steps to reduce nuclear dangers and nuclear risks. No first use is a simple idea. It basically says that the country promises not to use nuclear weapons first in a crisis. This is something that I think most Americans would be surprised to know, that the United States reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first. And that essentially means starting a nuclear war. If you use nuclear weapons first, you're not responding to an attack, a nuclear attack. You are taking the first step to initiate nuclear war, nuclear catastrophe.
And Elbridge Colby, how do you respond to Tom's argument?
Well, Donna, I share with Tom the desire to avoid a nuclear war and also to avoid a general war, but I think no first use pledge would actually be self-defeating in that respect. The best way to avoid the kind of war that is most likely to lead to nuclear use, which is a large-scale conventional war, is for everybody to understand that nuclear weapons are part of the calculus from the very beginning. Countries like the United States, Russia, China, everybody should understand that you can't fight a big conventional war without getting to a nuclear war. And I think the irony about a no first use pledge is that if it's actually believed, if countries believe the United States would never use nuclear weapons first, then essentially you recreate the conditions that existed before 1945, before 70 years of peace that have been correlated with the existence of nuclear weapons, which is to say the world is safe for conventional war. And I don't think we want to do that. We want countries to understand that we would only use nuclear weapons in really extreme circumstances, never lightly or cavalierly, but that we are prepared to use them in those kinds of circumstances. Conversely, if countries don't believe the pledge, well, then what's the real point? What's the attraction of the pledge? And I think this is not something that we have come to lightly. The United States has never adopted a no first use pledge, has thought about it quite a lot, particularly in the Obama administration in its early period. But in large part because we extend deterrence, because we've pledged to defend over 30 allies with our military capabilities, ultimately including our nuclear forces, and they have made it clear that they don't think that we should take a no first use pledge. We've elected never to do so.
Tom, I noticed that Donald Trump has said multiple times that he would never push the button, he would never initiate a war using nuclear arms. How do you feel that that plays into your position on this issue?
Well, I think and hope that it undermines the fact that no sane leader would ever use nuclear weapons first. And there's three reasons for that. One is it's unnecessary. The United States has conventional superiority in weapons. There's no need to resort to nuclear forces. Two, it would be tremendously unwise because if we went to nuclear weapons, we would give up the conventional advantage that we have right now. And three, it would be suicidal because if the United States were to use nuclear weapons against another state that had nuclear weapons, say Russia or China, there would be a response and it would be, again, the end of civilization as we know it.
How do you respond to Tom's position?
Well, I think if the world and the kind of set of dynamics that Tom described were what actually obtained, he might have a pretty compelling point. But there are two fundamental flaws. One is that American conventional superiority is nothing like what Tom is describing, and it's actually deteriorating. And secondly, there are ways of using nuclear weapons in limited fashion that the United States has planned for and contemplated for many, many decades, really since the beginning of the Kennedy administration. Of course, let me emphasize that we would never do so lightly and that we would always be conscious of the possibility of a very dramatic escalation. In fact, that's part of the point. But the only option for using nuclear weapons is not a total release. There are ways of using nuclear weapons in limited ways designed to de-escalate or terminate a conflict. But let me start at the beginning. Our fundamental strategy is to extend deterrence or effectively defend these 30-plus treaty allies, the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, others. And the way we do that is we're basically saying this is worthwhile for us for a variety of reasons because we think this is the most favorable world order that we're going to get. This is going to limit the further proliferation of nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And so we want to deter on behalf of them. Now, countries like Russia and China have different ideas. People argue about how aggressive they are, but we know the Russians are willing to use force. We know that the Chinese are pushing forward, and both countries feel alienated. So there's a plausibility of conflict. That means that we have to come up with serious military postures and strategies and capabilities to deal with them. And again, if Tom were right, and in some sense this was the world that obtained for the 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the American military reigned supreme conventionally. That is not really the case anymore, and it's not going to be the case, particularly in Asia, going forward in future decades. Our conventional forces will probably be the best in the world, but they won't be able to dominate in such a way that they can essentially best any challenger without serious contest. And in that kind of context, you want to be very clear to potential aggressors that even if they figure out imaginative or effective ways of using their non-nuclear forces to try to gain advantage and try to do things that cross our or our allies' core interests, that we always reserve the right to use nuclear weapons, including first, and that's particularly important in the Asia context where China is going to be an economy of roughly our size and probably will be able in the future to project very meaningful power. And the kind of decision that we need to take is, are we going to continue to have that credible extended deterrence, or are we going to allow for the proliferation of nuclear weapons to our allies? And my view is we should try to make extended deterrence, this way of kind of protecting our allies credibly, work, and that necessarily entails the potential for first use. And the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, and others have been very insistent on that. The other point where I think Tom is off base is this idea that the only way to use nuclear weapons is as a general release, as the kind of apocalyptic end of the world. That is always possible. And in fact, the longer a kind of war went on, it would become increasingly probable. But there's no inherent need why you would need to use nuclear weapons in that way first. In fact, I would never advocate for a large-scale first use of nuclear weapons. But really what we're talking about is a limited or discriminate use of nuclear weapons to try to persuade an adversary to back down. And that's, this was NATO's strategy during the Cold War with things called flexible response. By the way, it's kind of Russia's strategy today. They took a page out of our playbook. But basically, that's how nuclear weapons could and should, if they ever, God forbid, had to be used first, would be to say, hey, you've crossed a fundamental line and let me send you the most dramatic signal I possibly can.
Ultimately, if every country that has nuclear weapons agrees not to use them first, then we will never use nuclear weapons globally. That is the goal. And I will say, in response to Bridge, and with all due respect, the concept of limited use of nuclear weapons is a very dangerous concept. It's never been done. The only times nuclear weapons were ever used in the past is when only one country had them. No other country, and that was the United States, of course, against Japan. No other country at that time had nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have never been used when there's a possibility of response or retaliation against that use. And I submit that no president will ever use nuclear weapons first if a country can respond with nuclear weapons, because as much as Bridge might be confident that it would be a limited war, he has no control over that. You have no control of what your adversary does. If one side uses nuclear weapons, you have no idea what the response is going to be coming back. It could be, as I said, the end of civilization, and I'm not willing to take that risk.
So are you saying that there have been no technological advances that would allow that type of tapering or sizing of the...
No, certainly there are lower yield nuclear weapons, and this theory comes from the fact that you could use a small nuclear weapon and the other side might use just one small nuclear weapon and you could keep it contained at that level. But you might not. I mean, that's the thing, is the fog of war is pretty foggy, and the fog of nuclear war is impenetrable. Mm-hmm. And as soon as nuclear weapons start being used, you have no idea where this thing's going to go. And the best, safest thing to do is to not use nuclear weapons at all. Again, if a nuclear war starts, we all lose. There's going to be no winner. And so the only winner of a nuclear war is if you don't have one.
Bridge, I'm curious. I imagine that you folks have sort of red-teamed this among yourselves. So I wonder, what would have been the next country that you might hope would say, okay, if the United States agrees no first use, we will say also no first use. Have you looked at that strategically, at which countries might be on the table for joining in those forces?
I think if we could get the Russians to agree to a no first use pledge and to abide by it and to verifiably abide by it, that would really help us. But I think that and this I think gets to one of my problems with Tom's argument, is that there's essentially no chance that that's going to happen because the Russians have a deep strategic interest in being able to use nuclear weapons first. And I think Tom, kind of said if we could get all the countries of the world to agree that they would never use nuclear weapons first, then we wouldn't have a nuclear war. Well, I disagree. I actually think that you could get an extremely dangerous, the most dangerous situation in a sense is one in which there are nuclear arsenals all around the world. And a lot of people think that nuclear weapons wouldn't be used, but then you could get in a big conventional war, and then nuclear weapons would become very attractive. I mean, the United States for a century and a half did not attack, as I understand it, neutral shipping until the outbreak of World War II. It was a principle of our republic. And on December 8, 1941, an order went out to all U.S. submarines to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Countries, when they're in a serious war, they change. Their equities change, how valuable they think pledges that are made in a peaceful kind of context change, and so forth and so on. So I don't think a pledge is really that useful. I also think, I'm the farthest person from being cavalier about a limited nuclear war, but we have to take seriously that this is something that the United States and the whole NATO alliance thought through very carefully for 50 years, never really figured out the problem, but had the capabilities for limited use, and were very emphatic that we were prepared to go first against the Russians, who enjoyed a conventional advantage in Europe for all those years, and so in a sense is somewhat analogous to what's going on in Asia. But I think fundamentally a lot of what we're dealing with is what's the best way to deter a general war and big kind of aggression or coercion against our interests. And I think countries that have nuclear weapons are always going to have the option. And that option is going to be increasingly attractive if you get in a big conventional war. The key is to make sure that when they're thinking about the potential to go to war or to transgress our vital interests, that they understand that we always have that nuclear arrow in the quiver that you referred to, and not give them the impression that they could somehow outsmart us about that. And so I want that shadow to fall over their decision-making. If you look back at, for instance, Saddam Hussein's decision-making, it wasn't really a nuclear piece per se, but when he was thinking about invading Kuwait, he didn't understand clearly that the Americans would come and defend Kuwait and repel the Iraqis. That's the deterrence failure situation, is when you fail to make clear to the opponent that what you're prepared to do. And so I think a no first use direction actually makes war more likely and makes nuclear war more likely.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. Madeline Walsh asks, everyone knows the U.S. won't be the first to use nukes in a conflict, so isn't no first use already moot? Tom, how do you respond to that?
I completely agree with the questioner. I do not think any sane U.S. president would ever use nuclear weapons first, so we might as well take advantage of that and try to get other nations to take the same position.
Bridge, how do you respond?
Well, I just disagree with that. I mean, it's been a consistent U.S. policy for 70 years not to take that option off the table, and in fact, the military has built not only the plans but the capabilities to enable generally limited first use, also kind of crazier, big options. And in fact, our whole alliance, we consistently expressed to our allies that we would be prepared to use nuclear weapons first. Now, what would happen if, in the event the balloon went up? This is a fascinating historical and philosophical question, and Tom and I could be here for another month talking about it, so we won't bore you that way. But fundamentally, we've been persuasive enough, not only to our allies but to our potential adversaries, that we were prepared to go nuclear first. I'll give you an anecdote. We had some retired Russian military officers over recently, and I asked one of them why the Soviets never exploited their substantial advantages in conventional forces in Europe during the Cold War. During the Cold War, it's important to remind people thought that the Soviets could get to the English Channel in a couple of weeks. And he said, we could never figure out a way to do it in a way that wouldn't involve a general escalation, because we knew that you were going to use nuclear weapons first. So they were confident enough. And I think in the last 25 years, we've fallen out of this mindset because we've been so conventionally superior. But that's not the world that we're entering into. It's going to be more. It's not going to be as bad as the Cold War, I think, but it's going to be more competitive than the last generation.
Brendan Shaw asks, if the U.S. issues a no first use pledge, how likely is it that other nations will follow suit? Bridge, I think I know your answer, but why don't you take that one first?
Well, that's comforting. It means I'm consistent, I guess. But I think, my sense is basically countries on these kinds of core security issues, or also on core economic issues, they tend to look at their self-interest and the strategies that make sense to them. And so I don't see it as very persuasive that the United States is going to do something on its own deterrence strategy, and that other countries are going to mimic it. That's not how countries make decisions about their defense policy. Rather, they're probably likely to, they may shape how they talk about their policy and so forth, but they're likely to do what they need to do. And a classic example is, again, to return to the Cold War example, the Soviet Union had a no first use policy. Now, nobody really believed it, but it had a no first use policy during the later part of the Cold War. And then when the Soviet Army, the Red Army, collapsed and Russia became really weak conventionally, they abandoned it. Meanwhile, the United States, which had always emphasized the first use of nuclear weapons, when we became conventionally superior, we decided that we were going to start at least talking about no first use and minimize the role of nuclear weapons. So, countries kind of do what's in their interests, and so I think, I don't think that's how we should think about this problem.
Don.
I think the challenge with getting other countries to follow on no first use is that the U.S. no first use pledge must be credible. In other words, we must back it up with actions, not just words. And so if you say you will not use nuclear weapons first, there are steps you can take to make it clear to other countries that you mean it. For example, you could take your weapons off hair trigger alert. You could retire the kind of weapons that are most easily launched in a crisis. These are the kind of things that would convince other countries that you're serious about no first use, and then they would be more likely to follow along. I would say that even if no other countries follow along, it still would be in the U.S. interest to declare no first use because, as I said, we will never use them first anyway. We have nothing to lose, and we only have things to gain. So other countries, for example, that are considering whether they want to remain part of the nonproliferation regime, part of an effort to prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons, are concerned that the countries with nuclear arms, like the United States, aren't doing enough to reduce their nuclear risk, to make their nuclear policies more transparent and less threatening to other countries. This is something we could do.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who'd like to go first?
I'd be happy to.
Tom?
So let's see. I had one all prepared here. So, Bridge, when would it benefit the United States? What scenario would it benefit the United States to use nuclear weapons first?
Sure. I think in a situation in which China has established conventional superiority, if not dominance, over substantial parts of the Western Pacific, including with respect to U.S. allies, and a conflict either breaks out or they attempt to use that for leverage in a way that we and our allies resist, and a conflict breaks out, and you basically have a fundamental compromise of Allied territorial integrity, but a collapse of the U.S. and Allied conventional defensive position. I think a limited nuclear strike, for instance, against invasion forces or amphibious forces or the marshalling nodes or yards that are supporting them with a lower yield weapon or small number of weapons that are clearly distinguished from the kinds of weapons and the kind of strike that would be a general attempt at a disarming or decapitating strike. That's the kind of thing, and the point of that employment would be to demonstrate that we're super serious, the most gravely serious we could possibly be, to hurt them in a way that's meaningful, that shows that we're willing to go to that level and continue to do so if they continue the provocation, but also to demonstrate restraint and an interest in de-escalation. And I think that's the purpose of, that to me is the ideal kind of nuclear strategy. And that's the kind of scenario in which I envision. It's a terrible situation, but again, the point of that, and I think it's good to talk about it. It's good to exercise that kind of thing because it will demonstrate clearly to the Chinese, if they ever have any interest in it, that they're not going to be able to solve this riddle. And one of the things I really worry about with the Chinese is with the no first use pledge and with the continued discussion of market reduction of reliance on nuclear weapons is it's basically carte blanche for them to develop a conventional military dominance if they can in the Western Pacific and potentially to use it without fear.
So you'd be willing to risk San Francisco and Los Angeles in that scenario?
Well, ultimately, yeah. I mean, I think that's the whole point of our extended deterrence architecture, and I think that your question to that effect is revealing, because that's the whole basis of our alliance network and of our grand strategy, which is that that's what General de Gaulle said, and General de Gaulle said, "I don't believe you will trade New York for Paris," and that's why he pursued it.
But first use is different. Extended deterrence does not require first use of U.S. nuclear weapons. We can extend deterrence through conventional force, through responsive nuclear force. We don't need to use nuclear force first.
You're absolutely right, but what happens in a situation in which we don't have a conventional advantage? What happens if you're in the NATO and the Soviet Union or
I think that's very unlikely. We have such a huge conventional advantage that I don't see that happening.
Well, that's not what the Pentagon's saying. I mean, if you listen to Secretary Carter, Deputy Secretary Work, General Dunford, General Silva, I think our conventional advantage is in real trouble.
That's what they say to justify increasing defense budgets, but it's just not true.
Well, I mean, you get a lot of defense analysts independently saying, and fundamentally, look,
and a lot that say that that's not true.
I mean, I think fundamentally, if you look at it just a kind of a brass tacks way, the United States is trying to project power 10,000 miles across ocean, based on a small number of concentrated bases, as well as basing in Allied territory that's subject to coercion. What we're trying to do is really difficult. The Chinese are operating from their own country, similar with the Russians. So it's just a really tough military problem. And I'm like you. I'm a big believer in trying to sustain our conventional advantage. I was joking with Jeffrey Lewis, who's another very articulate advocate for the no first use position, and I said, Jeffrey, you're a nuclear dove, but you're a conventional hawk. And he said, yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I think no first use advocates, and the logic of what you're saying is we should be plussing up the defense budget on conventional forces, Tom, which I'm not sure is your intent.
I guess I would assert that we are so already conventionally superior that we don't have to do that.
Bridge, and what question do you have for Tom?
Yeah, I mean, Tom, it'd be great if you could explain why you think that the only possible use of nuclear weapons is one total apocalyptic kind of approach. Why can't you just, you have one bomb and you say, I'm going to use that one bomb, and then who knows what's going to happen, but why is that totally out of the realm of the possible?
Well, as you said, who knows what's going to happen? That's the problem.
Yeah.
The United States could certainly decide for itself that it's going to use one discrete, low-yield nuclear weapon somewhere. Presumably, that would be against a state that has nuclear weapons. And once you've done that, you have no idea what's going to come back. So to me, I would take every step to prevent that first use. Because if you take that step, you could have just ended civilization right there. And there are other things to do before that point. So I don't understand why any US president would put US civilization on the line when they do not have to.
All right, and now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other has said that he agrees with. Who'd like to start?
I can start this time, right? Well, I think I agree fundamentally with Tom about the desire to prevent a nuclear war. I mean, it's a bit cute, but I think that we are both. Tom may not agree, but I think we're both resolutely trying to prevent a nuclear war. And for me, that's also about preventing a large-scale conventional war or the kind of conditions that would lead to nuclear use. And that, my view is you can't isolate nuclear from the conditions under which it would develop. It was no accident that the atomic weapons were used against Japan at the end of a horrible war. By the end of which the United States had basically destroyed most of Japan's urban infrastructure. So my sense is you want to front load that thinking, that fear into any decision, that caution into any decision maker's mind that, hey, if we go this far with the Americans, they always have this option. They're not light on the trigger finger. They're not cavalier, but they reserve the right to go first. And I think that's that kind of making sure that any potential hostile power understands that is the best way to deter the kinds of circumstances that would lead to nuclear war.
Tom, is there anything that Bridge has said that you agree with?
Yes, I think we both agree that in terms of no first use, it will be hard to make other countries believe it, right? Again, the U.S. can say it, other countries may not believe it. And that's one of the challenges of the policy. And as I say, that's one of the reasons why we need to take concrete, discernible steps to make that more credible.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Elbridge Colby of the Center for a New American Security and Tom Colina of the Plowshares Fund for joining us to discuss this issue.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Donna Davis. We'll see you next time.